Welcome to our second module on race and ethnicity. This time we're going to be looking at the theoretical perspectives and how they view race and ethnicity. Also, we'll be talking about intergroup relations, and so the spectrum of how different racial and ethnic groups um, interact with one another. Um, and then we'll finish it up by looking at the status of some of the largest racial and ethnic groups in the United States today. All right, so we're starting with the functionalist perspective, which we always start with. I think next time, maybe for gender and sexuality, maybe we'll start with the conflict. Maybe we'll start with interactionists. I don't know. But for race and ethnicity, the functionalist perspective, remember that it states that even the things we view as being negative, the things that we view as being problematic, serve some sort of purpose and perhaps some sort of benefit to someone in society. And since it's macro level, it's going to be for someone who maintains power or for some group or category that dominates in society. So we have Nash, who identifies three functions of racial prejudice. So, three ways that racial prejudice or racism can be functional, at least for some people, those who benefit from it. So, the first way is as a moral justification, right? Racism can be used to justify inequality. It can be used to justify maintaining inequality by stating that some people are inferior and thus deserve less. Another function is that racism can discourage the subordinate minority from even attempting to question its lowly status because that racism can be so deeply embedded in the racist policies and have such strong justifications that have, kind of stood the test of time, that even the minority themselves who is experiencing that injustice wouldn't challenge it because that would be challenging the very foundation of society. And then the third is that racial myths suggest that trying to eliminate these inequalities would just make things worse. So even today, this still persists. There are all sorts of different types of programs that could help to alleviate inequalities, like reparations, like affirmative action, or like universal basic income. And we see a lot of opposition against these programs and a lot of people railing on and on about why they wouldn't work or why they would be more costly. And I would implore you to dig deeper into those arguments and see where are they really coming from. And often they're coming from a place of fear that one might lose their advantage or lose their ability to exploit others. Right. So just like those things that I named today, affirmative action, reparations, and universal basic income, people use this tactic, use these racial myths in the past to justify and to um, to kind of lie about what would happen if the enslaved were free, right? And so that used to be an argument. Oh, we can't end slavery. What will happen to the poor souls? Where will they go? How can they live? Who will take care of them if they're not on my plantation? Right. And so that is really a strategy or a trick that's often used to kind of cover for the fact that someone feels like their power and their ability to exploit will be threatened. Rose also identifies four dysfunctions of racial prejudice. So ways that racism undermines our social systems. The first is that discrimination, racial discrimination, fails to use the gifts and talents of everyone, right? And impairs everyone, including those who are part of the dominant power majority. The second is that discrimination aggravates social problems and is costly to all, including dominance. That the systems that are necessary to maintain discriminatory actions are expensive and costly in time and energy and financially as well. In a similar vein, a dysfunction is that it takes a lot of time and money to defend barriers to equality. So often the same kinds of costs that people are complaining about with those racial myths um, are exacerbated by people trying to avoid the same those same myths that they've created, right? Trying to maintain these systems that keep people out, that make it so that not everyone can access something. These are costly systems. Just think about testing, for example. The testing that we use to determine who can go to what school, which has a long history of being racially and ethnically biased, and also biased against women, and having class bias as well. These things are costly, and they cost us all, right? They're very expensive to be run. They're very expensive for all of the individual families who have to pay for the tests, and for the schools who are accessing the results. And so, as a result of that, we're paying a lot to maintain the system that is used to discriminate against others. And then finally, racial prejudice and discrimination can undercut goodwill and diplomatic international relationships. And we can see this very clearly. Anytime we're having conflicts with other nations, those nations can easily use our own conflicts within our nation when it comes to race and ethnicity as examples for how we might be irrelevant or how we can't be trusted or something like that. And it has been used against the US a lot in the past. Um, the hypocrisy that comes along with trying to get involved in other nations' diplomatic issues, and having our own issues that kind of mirror those relationships, it's not a good look. Okay. So, yeah. So, the interactionist perspective has two pretty simple theories. Um, so they're both based on this idea that race and ethnicity are really strong symbols for our identities, and they're both more micro level. So the first is the contact hypothesis, which basically suggests that exposure to people with different racial and ethnic backgrounds can actually lead to um, those people becoming less prejudiced and to them abandoning old stereotypes. But it has some requirements that are necessary for this to happen. So you can't just throw people of different races and ethnicities into a group or into a neighborhood together and say, all right, now get along, right? You actually would need for them to be involved in a cooperative circumstance where they have equal status. And through our school settings, through our workplaces, and a lot of our social interactions and our social institutions, that doesn't always happen, right? Often we'll see that people either aren't working in cooperation and or they don't have equal status. We have tons of bureaucracy. We have different levels of merit. And so in order for contact hypothesis to really have any effect, you need um, those two key elements to be there. Another theory is that called the culture of prejudice, and that simply suggests that prejudice is embedded in culture, and that a lot of the references we use, a lot of the stereotypes that we use, it surrounds us in our culture, and that we have casual expressions of racism and prejudice. It's built into our idioms. There are lots of things that more recently we've kind of abandoned some things, but others that are just popping up that we um, don't even realize we're using, but that can have those undertones. We're seeing that culture of prejudice show up in the change or be challenged, not really showing up. It's been showing up, but being challenged when it comes to mascots, right? For football teams and different sports teams. When we talk about appropriation, even, and like how interesting it is to see somebody's ethnicity turn out to be like a costume or a joke for someone else. Um, we also see this in like the language. Like I said, the other day I had someone apologize to me because they used a phrase jokingly that my husband had sold them up river, right? Because he kind of like told on them in a joking way um, about something that really didn't matter. And I didn't even catch it. I didn't catch that idiom, which basically is saying like I sold you up the river. Basically means like literally I sold you up or down the river into like slave states, like from Virginia to Georgia, which was thought to mean a worse situation, right? So it's like an act of betrayal, right? And so these little elements of that prejudice, right, show up all over the place. Okay, so I just realized I wasn't recording initially, so I've already gone through this whole slide once. So here's the second time that I'm going to do it. So with conflict perspective, we're looking at injustice and exploitation. So starting with labeling theory, this is a focus on injustice. And remember that labeling theory is both interactionist and conflict theory territory. So, labeling theory falls under both, and here people are profiled and stereotyped based on some identity. For this module, we're looking at race and ethnicity specifically. And so we'll be looking at racial profiling or arbitrary action initiated by an authority based on race, ethnicity, or national origin. So instead of focusing again on the minorities themselves or the subordinate group itself, here we're focusing on who are these authorities and how are they using these racial and ethnic categories in order to treat people differently, right? How are they using this in their traffic stops? How are they using these things in their classroom? How are they labeling people based on skin color and phenotype as being good or bad, right? Negative or positive, criminal or innocent? The second theory is intersection theory, which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black female lawyer, and then later built upon by Patricia Hill Collins, a Black female social scientist. I can never remember if she's a sociologist proper or not. And basically, it looks at how we can't separate the effects of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, all these other identities, and how they intersect, right? And so Kimberly Crenshaw formed the idea of intersectionality because quite literally, Black women were going to court with cases of discrimination. And those cases were being thrown out because judges couldn't identify if the case was solely about race or solely about sex. So here's what Kimberly Crenshaw said. If you are standing in the way of multiple forms of exclusion, you are likely to get hit by both. First, the race ambulance medics come and say, sorry, you need the gender ambulance. And then they're followed by the gender ambulance, whose medics tell them to call the race ambulance. So basically, the law had no way of dealing with the wrongs done to women of color because judges had trouble figuring out whether the harm was a racial harm or a gender harm. Can you imagine throwing a valid case out? You acknowledge it as valid and you throw it out because you can't determine which is the problem because both are the problem. And so Kimberly Crenshaw, as a lawyer, says, here's a bright idea. It could be both. We can't separate them, right? You can't just say, okay, you need to go see, or create a case about race because I don't think this is about sexism. You can't separate being in these marginalized identities. I am a Black woman. I am at no point only a woman or only Black, right? And so, yeah. So think about some of the outcomes of these intersectionalities of ethnicity and any other identities you have, right? And also think about the fact that these intersections means that most individuals will have varying identities, and some may be points of privilege, while others are seen as points of deviance or divergence. So I always give myself as an example. I am a Black woman of color. I am from an impoverished background. I am a first generation college student. And despite that, I still have a lot of privilege now because I am highly educated, because I speak English and live in the United States, which means I have an American passport, because I am employed and I am heteronormative, right? And so I have these competing identities and that means that am I below, as far as status goes, as far as the power of my voice goes, am I below all white people or all white men? No, right? Compared to some who may have different backgrounds, I might be viewed with having higher status, right? And so, really, I love intersectionality because it looks at the complications here. And then finally, we get exploitation theory. This is a Marxist class theory that says that prejudice and discrimination support capitalist systems, that racism keeps minorities in low class positions, low status positions, and jobs, and as a cheap labor pool, which in turn means that there's always this threat that low status dominant group members can be replaced by this cheap minority labor pool. So they are all miserably put in their places. And so this can be used as a strategy, this exploitation, to separate people and keep them from working together. And in particular, separating the poorer, less powerful members of a society, who there are also more of, right? And so race in the United States has been used in this way often, and as a mechanism to keep the lower status members of society at odds with one another and fighting one another and blaming their status on one another, rather than turning their eyes and attention to the problem, the people who are creating the fight, the capitalists. And so I think that right now we're in an exciting time because we're seeing all of this organization and unionizing happening that crosses over these divides and that people are able to fight back for a better life. We saw this with the UAW recently, the auto workers pushing back. And, it's not perfect. And the capitalists will kind of like, they'll let them have a little win, but then try to throw in, a couple of blows or punches again to discourage them. But I think that if they continually keep organizing and staying together, without like letting the capitalists kind of intercede or intervene, we're going to see like some really cool revolutions where people have a better quality of life overall, and better opportunities to provide for themselves and their families. So when it comes to intergroup relations between different races and ethnicities and nationalities, we have a spectrum of tolerance here. So we usually start at the worst end, and end up at a better end, hopefully, when we're discussing this. And hopefully that's how it works for humanity altogether. So, for example, there's genocide, which is the least tolerable interaction, where there's a deliberate and systematic killing of an entire group or nation. We've seen this through the Armenian genocide. We've seen this through the Holocaust. And many are saying today that we're seeing this again in the Middle East as well. And it hasn't just been said today, it's kind of been a talking point that's been brought up since 1948. Expulsion is also pretty intolerant. And that's where you expel or push an entire group or nation out of that nation, right? You force them out, make them leave. Another term that we look at is succession, or the drawing of formal political boundaries between groups. And so succession actually happens when one state is split into two, right? They've seceded. And so a famous example of this would be India splitting into India and Pakistan. I would point out that this doesn't always fix the problems between these groups, and that those lines are often drawn arbitrarily and have some really negative outcomes or results. Then there's segregation, where there's physical separation between two groups, but within the same geopolitical boundaries. We have de jure segregation, and that's segregation that is enforced by law, as well as de facto segregation, where it's not because of law, but because of other factors, where we acknowledge that it exists, even though there's no law for it. So, for example, in the United States, we have a lot of segregation still, even though segregation is not legal. We have residential segregation, right? Our neighborhoods where we live, are very much segregated due to multiple practices, but not one that says Black people can't live with white people or Asian people can't live with Hispanic and Latino people, right? Um, Typically, it's because of practices in real estate or in lending, but also our social practices and who we want to live with and how we draw these lines through class as well, which intersects with race. Um, and then there's separatism, which you actually don't have on your image. But this is where a marginalized group actually desires physical separation in their functions. And so one example would be Black nationalists who are not necessarily victims of segregation, but who have chosen to separate from the majority for safety reasons or because they feel threatened or have just a difficult life. Then we start to get towards the more tolerant ends, but that does not mean that each of these things is a good thing. Okay. So, for example, assimilation, that's where perhaps one gives up or loses some elements of their own culture and ethnicity to become part of another or part of a dominant culture or ethnicity. Assimilation can be voluntary, but it has often in the United States also been very much forced, very much involuntary. One example would be those residential schools that Native Americans were sent to live at, the boarding schools, basically, where they were forced to assimilate, to change their hair, to stop speaking their language, to stop following their spirituality, and things like that. Then there's amalgamation, which is always really interesting. That's where a majority group and a minority group combine to form a new group altogether. And so, yeah, there's a sign of intolerance there. If people are intermarrying and entering to interracial relationships and reproduction, then it's pretty much a sign, that there's increased tolerance. And then the one that actually is a goal, or the one that's most a goal, is pluralism. And that's where groups can coexist without assimilating. That's where there is a mutual respect between groups. This is not the limit of intergroup relations or relationships, but it's where we're going to stop for today. If you take race and ethnicity, we'll add some more onto that in the future.